You're listening to the Religion Unplugged podcast. I'm Matthew Peterson. Today I'll be speaking with historian, professor, and writer David N. Hempton about his recent book, Christianity at the Crossroads, the Global Church from the Print Revolution to the Digital Era. David, thanks so much for making time for us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you're obviously tackling um, an unbelievable amount of information and time. Reading through was like
Mhm.
crazy how many things are connected to uh, other movements, and you don't tell things chronologically. You let things you do loosely. There's sort of a light, like you do sort of start print and you end in digital, but all throughout you're making comparisons to stuff that happened years later or before, depending on whatever theme you're talking about. And the whole book is framed through this system that you call networks, nodes, and nuclei. Can you
Yeah.
talk about that structure to begin with and how it informs how you structure the book?
Okay. Well, look, thank you. Yes, there is a lot going on in the book. If I back up just a little bit to say how the book came into being, it really was the writing up of the Gifford Lectures, which I gave in the University of Edinburgh in 2021, which is a very old distinguished lecture series that William James gave one of the first of them. It's over 100 years old. And I was a kind of rare historian to be given an invitation. They're usually natural theologians or philosophers or whatever. So I was keen to cover a big topics. So I deliberately chose 500 years of the history of Christianity from the print revolution to the digital era. Really because I didn't want to just drill down on my academic specialisms. I wanted the series to be accessible and to be raising big issues. So that's how I decided on the chronology. And then beyond that, and getting to your question about the nuclei, nodes, and networks, quite a lot of religious history or history of Christianity is written within national traditions. Americans do American religious history, the French do French, etc. Or they operate within denominations. Roman Catholics do Catholic, Methodists do Methodist or whatever. Or they operate within very specific time and geographical specificity. So I wanted to think of something that would enable me to deal more with the global church, with international trends. I also wanted to get below denominational structures and formal mechanisms. And so I hit on this, alliterative trio of nuclei, nodes, and networks. And the nuclei, what I mean by that is that what is there in religious traditions of whatever one we're talking about that enables it to transcend national boundaries? I mean, for example, I did a lot of my early work on Methodism, which started off in England and then became the fastest growing religious movement in the United States, and then moved throughout the world. And I visited the largest Methodist church in the world now, which is in Seoul, South Korea. So how do you explain a religious tradition like that, being able to move around the world like that? Is there an inner DNA core that wherever it pops up, this is recognizably Methodism? So that's what got me into the idea of nuclei. And then nodes. What I was thinking of as religious movements move around the world, there are junction boxes or places where something connects with something else and something new develops. So a couple of examples I give in the book are like the Fetter Lane Society in London in the 1730s, which brings together German pietists, Scottish reformers, English revivalists, American colonists. And something fresh happens as a result of those connections. Or the Azusa Street revival in Los Angeles in 1906, when lower class blacks, whites, and Hispanics meet in a in an unpretentious place in LA and launches, or at least is part of one of the biggest religious movements of all time, the rise of Pentecostalism in the 20th century. So nodes are those places where there's a junction happening, and different things are beginning to collide and influence one another. And then the networks are perhaps the most obvious one. How do um, what how do these religious movements move around? What are the networks? What do they need to? Do they need communications networks? Do they need sailing ships? Do they need sometimes they're spread through military deployments. And so what are the networks? What networks do they start to construct for themselves? So I kind of thought that this um, uh, trio of ideas would give rise to almost a fresh way of thinking about the history of Christianity that would allow it to be more international, more connected, more more almost to try and recreate the dynamism of it and the flexibility of it. So I think that's what was going on in my in my choice. And I would also say maybe just one final thing before allowing you some space is that this was the first set of lectures given after the COVID-19 epidemic, and that was kind of fresh in my mind a little bit. What was the inner DNA of that? What was the COVID virus? Where did it start? How did how did it become disseminated? Originally probably in Wuhan in China, probably through Chinese rail networks, and then through international networks and air travel to cities in Italy and North America, and then throughout the world. So that idea of how things start, move from place to place, what are the network connections that make that possible? These are the ideas that were in my mind when I started writing it.
Hmm. No, no, I think that's very helpful to
Mhm.
set the scene and frame the rest of the conversation on. And I'm really interested in that in the virus thing. I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. I think that's very much on the brain for a lot of us in these
Yeah,
preceding years. So it's natural, I think, to relate to and to make sense of things through that lens. So I appreciate that.
yeah.
And speaking of like dissemination, I mean, something I was really interested in the beginning when you're talking about the early Reformation and
Mhm.
Luther, it's not a new idea to hear that the printing press was revolutionary for the Protestant church. It helped make the Reformation. I mean, the Reformation would not have been even close to as powerful as it was probably without the printing press. But something I think you emphasized that I hadn't really seen emphasized before was that actually the Reformation also seems to have greatly affected the printing industry and made the
Mm.
printing industry what it was. So how did the Reformation not only just um, find strength through the printing press, but actually strengthen the use of the printing press?
Yeah, well, I think that there is a kind of a connective tissue between those two things. I mean, there's a very fine book called Brand Luther by a historian in Scotland, Andrew Pettigrew, and he really makes the point of just the proliferation of Lutheran materials, many of them written by Luther, some by his followers, and their connection to printing presses in the German Empire then, and just the amount of reprints and the injection it gave into capitalist enterprises just by expanding markets. and expanding networks of distribution. So that this was that there was a kind of happy harmony between these things. But also, I mean, some things that I kind of didn't know very much about when I started this was also the way in which that emphasis on literacy changed so many other things. Even according to some neurobiologists, even some of our neural mechanisms of how we appropriate religion, more through verbal text, less through images, and so on. So I really did feel that the more I found out about the printing industry and the dissemination of Lutheran propaganda, essentially, the more that there was a harmony of interest here. And of course, this fed into some bourgeois elites in the German cities. So all of these things are linked, social change, emergence of new social classes, new methods of production, new methods of distribution, ways in which ideas are communicated in, through print. All of this, had a really big impact. And of course, as I got into that, I got interested in lots of other, Reformation networks. How did Reformed churches around the world begin to connect with one another and how did the Radical Reformation, the Anabaptists, what were their sites and distribution? So once I got into the idea of networks and of course through publishing and others, then the more I could see the value of this way of thinking about religious change.
Hmm. Yeah, and you touched on something I really wanted to get into as well, which is sort of how these Reformed churches, Protestant churches, related to one another.
Mm.
Because, for centuries you have this Catholic Church where the network is very clear
Yeah,
and the hierarchy is very clear and everybody's sort of connected in some
yeah.
way or another. How did the differences in theology and culture that Protestants held close to them, how did those differences affect the structure of the societies that they created in comparison with the societies that the Catholic Church created?
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. And of course, it often depends on lots of political and contextual circumstances. I mean, there's very good books on how the Reformation disseminates itself differently in different national traditions according to, the political structures and so on. But if you look at the Reformed churches, for example, often with a strong filial base in Geneva with Calvin's, experiments there. Um, and most of the time, these Reformed churches are operating without access to political power directly. And this is true of many of the radical Reformation traditions as well. So networks become increasingly important because it's not being sponsored by states which have their, mechanisms already in place. I mean, the old territorial model of Christendom, where churches are effectively the religious and propaganda organs of states, and countries are mapped out in territorial parishes. That's a way of Christianizing populations, with their resident clergymen or priests and so on. So the Reformation opens up different patterns of ecclesiastical organization, either through brotherhoods of Reformed churches, confessions of faith, or in the case of the Anabaptists, cases of just not very deeply connected but important relational contacts with churches in different parts of Europe and then increasingly the wider world. And there are occasions in which, one of these reformed branches, like Lutheranism or like Reformed Calvinism, actually become established churches themselves. So the Scandinavian churches do become established in Lutheranism. And the Church of Scotland becomes a Reformed Calvinist church, and it's still an established church to this day. In the American colonies, Puritanism and Calvinism becomes almost a de facto religious establishment. But then they are all disestablished, after the American Revolution, when there is allegedly a separation of church and state, which of course is now under. So very different patterns emerge from different parts of the world, and very different attitudes to. I mean, there's still a very low grade appreciation of religious toleration for another couple of centuries. In other words, whatever the established church or religion is in a place, there's not much de facto toleration of religious minorities. And that's true in Catholic parts, it's true in Lutheran parts, it's true in the Church of England, which is an Episcopalian established church. But yeah, so different patterns are emerging. But within that, these Reformation channels, and it's true also of Catholicism with the rise of the Jesuit order, which they're able to establish this phenomenal network of schools and colleges, over 500 of them in Europe, and also a network of missionary connections. So there's a classic example of a religious organization with its own nuclei, the spiritual exercises of Ignatius, with their own networks, the colleges and the missionary letters and organizations, which is able to, survive and thrive for centuries.
Hmm. Yeah, I was really interested in that detour you took a long time talking about the Jesuits, and it was fascinating how they managed to be a network inside of another network, sort of, and
Mm.
the complications that would
Yeah,
have had. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, I'm also interested in you spent a whole chapter um, dedicating time to discussing women's networks.
Yes,
And it was, pretty amazing to see all the differences that there are um, in networks that are built by women versus built by men. And I think also it was surprising, I think, to see that women have managed to um, greatly influence different structures during times when, at a societal level and at a church level, they had very little power or say in anything.
yes.
Um, I'd love for you to talk some about that and what you discovered about the way that men and women, build networks, religious networks differently.
Yeah, that's a great question, and a bit of, confession of the soul here, in the sense that I did quite a lot of my early work on the rise of Methodism as a religious tradition, which, at the time that I started research on it, the best historians in the field were mostly Marxists, E.P. Thompson, Christopher Hill, or Hobsbawm, and so on. And I was determined to push back on that a little bit, but I still accepted many of the assumptions that, would, if I was trying to find out about Methodism, I was looking at male preachers, I was looking at the archives that I was ransacking, which were constructed by men and almost always about men, about the formation of theological colleges, all men, the the building of chapels, all done by male trustees, etc., etc. And then it became clear through, detailed sociological work on Methodist classes, the people who were in the Methodist organization, that probably more than two-thirds, close to three-quarters of rank and file Methodists were women. So how does it change your view of how a religious organization operates if your concentration is on the rank and file women who make up the most of the of its adherents? And this is true of most religious traditions in Christianity. Almost all have majorities of women. And there you enter a different world of, in the case of Methodism, you enter a world of female preachers and class leaders. domestic visitation, sick visitation, hospitality, raising of children, um, um, forming their own communities around childbirth and dealing with infant mortality, and thinking of different kinds of faith questions around groups of women meeting rather than groups of men leading. So that got me to see that looking at women's networks was a really fresh way of looking at the transmission of Christianity in the period we're looking at. And I come up with this very, perhaps too formulaic, five-point way of delineating, women's networks. Some are built around spiritual fellowship and sisterhoods. I look especially at Aglow International, which is a women's movement within Pentecostalism, linking many different cells of Pentecostalism. And then I look at some organizations where women were able to, um, 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 find a degree of autonomy within organizations started by men. So things like many missionary organizations, because the majority of Protestant missionaries certainly were women. Um, 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 and then I look at some organizations, and the student Christian movement is another example of something that was started by men, but women, have an enormous role in and form their own cells and so on. Um, and then I looked at some women's organizations which were meant to deliberately protest against male controls. So Catholic women's organizations trying to open up the priesthood, or to press for reproductive rights, or whatever. And then you look at some other organizations like the Latter-day Saints, where there has been a very strong tradition of male leadership and the exercise of theological power. But the growing importance of women in that tradition to begin to advance women's interests and women's and another one that one of my own doctoral students was looking at what she calls the rise of disenchanted evangelical women in the United States who now form online communities because they're unhappy with the kind of theology it's called complementarianism that privileges male headship in relationships, marriages, churches, and so on. And these women have formed their own online community. She calls them, female counterpublics, where they meet together, have conferences, have discussions online, produce their own literature as a way of almost subverting, or at least not subverting is probably the wrong word, as a way of maintaining a distinctive woman's voice, either on the margins of evangelicalism or on some occasions, they move outside. So I'm really intrigued about the way women, everything from, religious sisterhoods and cloisters to voluntary organizations to protest movements. And there's something distinctive about the way women organize into networks because most of the time they don't have the power or the control or the inheritance of theological power and its interpretation. So it often gives forth very deep kinds of connections and fellowship because it's being forged by the women themselves. And I find even reading widely in these networks, a kind of very moving sense of camaraderie and joy and of being seen and of having influence all of these things bred a degree of little joy and community affection, and that's really quite palpable.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, that's very cool. And you mentioned it inside of that answer, um, but obviously you end the book with the digital age,
Yes,
and obviously there's overlap throughout the book, like in the women's chapter, but there's so many different paths we could go down to talk about Christianity in the digital age and the good
yes,
and the bad. But something I was really interested in is at the beginning of that chapter, um, you talk about how you talk about kind of setting the scene for what is already true of the world, of society, of Christianity before the digital age begins.
yes,
And you talk about, you know, mass secularism being very popular, and we're kind of
yeah,
in this secular age. And
yeah.
so I guess what I want to understand is how much of the evolution that's happened to Christianity in recent years is a result of the secular age, and how much of
Yeah.
it is the digital revolution, and where are they, combined?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, these are very difficult and interconnecting questions, as you rightly point out. What I was keen to do, especially towards the end of the book, was pay sufficient attention to what is an enormous revolution in the demography of Christianity in the 20th century world. At the beginning of the 20th century, circa 1900, about two-thirds, three-quarters, certainly a very high percentage of world Christians were located in Europe and North America. That has dramatically shifted. Four-fifths of world Christians now live outside that place, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, in South and East Asia. So there has been a dramatic revolution in the global demography of Christianity. And that global change, which is partly, there's lots of reasons for how that has happened, which I go into in the book, but it's a fact, and it's an ongoing fact, and that precedes the digital era. This was going on before the last 30, 40, 50 years. But the social media digital era has changed the dynamics of it. So there are now very big mega churches in places like in sub-Saharan Africa, places like Lagos and Nigeria, which have set themselves as tasks of evangelizing, Africa, but also the rest of the world, and building churches in Europe and North America, almost as a way of re-Christianizing the secular West. And this is a big thing that's happening. And of course, all kinds of digital communication systems are making this more possible. Um, um, Now, I think it's still too early to figure out what real impact the digital side of this is having. I mean, we now know, looking back 500 years later, the impact of print. Um, but it took, even with historians, it took uh, decades and decades before it became clear what this was, that these Reformation divides and the wars of religion and the ongoing, fragmentation of Christian churches, all of these things weren't immediately obvious when through the printing presses in Germany. And the digitally, it's still, there's a degree of agnosticism in my chapter on that. Um, will some traditions fare better than others under this? Is it harder to reproduce ritual and community online for some traditions than others? Can you have funerals and masses online? Um, 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 Are conversionist religious movements better able to do this? Is it going to change the way people meet, less in-person fellowship? Will it change the way people get their information? I mean, um, at first, we all thought that this era would produce more choice, so we could log on to our favorite religious traditions or whatever. But what is being seen is that often people you know, pick up on a particular thread or group, and therefore it can be a narrowing thing, almost like, it has the capacity to even promote almost a kind of cultish, forms of religion online and conspiracy theories and all sorts of things. Um, will it mean that the funding models of churches will change dramatically? I mean, I did, these independent network charismatic churches, INC churches as they're called, have very different funding models. They are low on buildings, low on staff, higher on products, on services, on conferences, on fees, on selling things, and so on. So it's less of a plate collection model of funding. Will that have dramatic impact on how churches see themselves more as a consumer products, and less as fellowships of believers? Or all of these things are up for grabs. Um, and I try to set it in the context of this bigger global shift in the demography of Christianity. Um, um, it's really very complicated. I mean, I wrote a short essay recently for the tablet where I brought together some of this material with Colin McCann's new novel called Twist, where he creates these characters who repair undersea cables, which are really the connective tissue of our digital era. Um, and the novel is really about the irony that the people making the connection to these cables often have very little connection with one another or with their relationships, their spouses, their children. And there's this tension that the more connected we get, the less connected we are. And this is one of the great paradoxes of the social media era that everyone is now paying attention to. These great hopes from all of these platforms that somehow would draw the human family across the world together, sometimes only produces more isolation and more. Um, so, so the so one question I did grapple with seriously in the book, and which I hope more people will write more seriously about, is that how has Christianity changed by the means of transmission? So, how has Christianity changed from visual culture to print? How was Christianity changed when empires started constructing their power bases in the global south? How was Christianity changed? How is Christianity being changed by um, um, uh, the digital era? Um, and I think these are really, because the assumption is that Christianity is somehow the same all the time, but just the communication style changes. That's just not true. Christianity changes with the communication channels through which it's being communicated. And I think it's too soon to tell how that's going to impact, the Christianity in the modern period. But what we know for sure is that there's going to be greater influence from the global south. There's going to be more manipulation of social media. There's going to be more emphasis on technology and facilitators, and perhaps less on old-fashioned theological colleges and priests and ministers. There's going to be a lot of big changes, which I think we're still at the very early stages of.
Mm. Yeah, these are powerful questions and considerations for us going into the deeper into the belly of the digital beast. So
Yes,
appreciate
yeah.
appreciate all of that. I
Yeah.
think that's what we have time for today, David. So, everybody, that is David N. Hempton. His book is Christianity at the Crossroads. You can find that in the show notes below. David, thanks again so much for making time for us. Really, really appreciate it.
Matthew, it's been a great pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for your very insightful and really deeply thought-provoking questions. I'm very grateful to you. It's been a pleasure.